Good evening, everyone. You're all incredibly welcome to this week's 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. Good evening, guys. So this evening we are partnering with One Dublin One Book to present tonight's edition of 120 Stories. And so I'm really incredibly delighted to have our two guests with us this evening. So our first guest is Rónán Hession, who is the author of Leonard Hungry Paul, which is this year's One Dublin One Book. And then we're also delighted to be joined by Fíona Scarlett, who is joining us to speak about Boys Don't Cry. I've had the immense good fortune of getting an early copy of the book, which is due to be imminently released. So really looking forward to chatting with you both this evening. To everyone joining in with us, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. If you've got questions over the course of the evening for either of our authors, please do type them in and we will make our way through them. But I guess I'm just going to jump straight in, and I'd love to just find out a little bit about the worlds that both of these stories happen within. So Fiona, in Boys Don't Cry, it's set in quite a recognisable Dublin. So for everyone who's joining us, I wonder if you could just kind of set the scene for us and tell us where the story takes place.
Yeah, so it's set sort of in and around inner city Dublin. It's sort of in a fictitious tower block in the city centre, but at the back of my mind the whole time was the old sort of Ballymun flats, really. So that's really where it's set. That's
Yeah, great. Well, wonderful. Thank you. It's and what kind of inspired you to start looking at this as a location?
yeah, well, the main thing really that inspired me was my own dad, who he sort of grew up in inner city Dublin, just off Dorset Street. Well, he was in a lot of different places, but that's the place that he recognised most as home. So I can see a Mary Scarlett there now in the audience, and I don't think it's my mum, I think it's my aunt, because I can see a Margaret Daly there too. So hello. But yeah, so it sort of was inspired a lot by him and where he grew up. And when he was about, I suppose, 10 or 11, his father signed up my dad and his brother Kieran to do music lessons. There was a man in Parnell Square, Paddy Murray, who was given free music lessons for children in the city to learn music. So it just really, music was his whole life, you know, it was absolutely everything. And to be given that opportunity, and then from that he got a scholarship to the College of Music himself and his brother Kieran. And then when he was in his 30s, mid-30s, he went to college to train as a secondary school teacher and worked in our local community in a disadvantaged school to give that opportunity back to other children in his care, I suppose, if you want to say. So my dad passed away in December, so this book in particular is really, really bittersweet because there's a lot of his inspiration is in this book. So it's a really strange thing to be going through at the moment, but at the same time, it's great that this is here sort of as a memento to him, I suppose, as well. So,
and what a kind of a gorgeous love letter, if that's one way to think of it. It's, well, thank you for sharing that with us. And then just in terms of kind of setting the world up, like Rónán, with Leonard Hungry Paul, you know, it's a lovely story where there's not a huge amount of drama, and nor are we in one very clearly defined location. Like it's I think you built two really beautiful characters that we get a really interesting impression of, but your kind of labels are perhaps not something at the forefront throughout the course of this book. And I'd love to hear how you describe the world that our protagonists are in.
Yeah, thanks, and good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. I suppose now that the One Dublin One Book is officially underway and it's too late for them to take it off me, I can be open about the fact that it's not specifically set in Dublin. At this stage, it's too late for them to get alternative posters done up or anything, so I'm safe in being a bit more open about that. The book is set at a time and place that should hopefully feel not far from here and now, wherever the reader is. You know, so I've had people say, oh, this is definitely Dublin. I've had people say that this is definitely somewhere in the UK. I've had people say that it feels like Connecticut. I think the main thing is the title you're asking about the world that Leonard and Hungry Paul occupy, and you could probably geographically locate it somewhere between their ears and somewhere behind their eyes. They are people who are very much living in their heads, who have a particular curiosity, I think, about the world. There is, I think, still a sort of newness and innocence about the way they look at the world, but they're not stupid. They have simply tried to understand the world themselves, so that it hasn't been explained to them. They haven't got a huge amount of experience to go by. So they've come to very sort of idiosyncratic views of the world. And in terms of your question around, there aren't that many labels or signs, and that's quite true. It's quite a deliberate thing in the book. There aren't surnames, there aren't location names, there aren't many physical descriptions. And part of the reason is that when you start to put that sort of stuff in a book with people like Leonard and Hungry Paul, they get so easily crowded out. And it would be so easy to sort of reduce them to a label or a shortcut. And that just puts us back to where we usually are. And if you want to look at stuff that's so easily missed, you do need to keep some of that in the background. So that's why it hopefully doesn't feel alien, but at the same time, it's not possible to place it, exactly. And just in terms of what Fiona was saying there about the location she describes in the book is so brilliant. Before I started in the civil service, I was a postman up and down the Ballymun flats. And so I would recognize it. I can recognize the landings. I could recognize the stairwells and the sort of atmosphere. So it was brilliantly recreated, Fiona.
Thanks, Rónán.
Absolutely. And one sentence that really, for whatever reason, it stuck with me, and it was something that I kind of have had floating around the back of my head for the last couple of days, was, I've just written it down here: Hungry Paul woke up just before the alarm at 6 a.m. as he did most Mondays. What that shouted to me was a human who was fundamentally content in life. That you're waking up before your 6 a.m. alarm on a Monday. And there was part of me at moments during the course of the story that kind of wondered if we were less concerned of what other people thought, might we be slightly more like the two characters in the book. And it kind of, when you talked there a moment ago about what's going on, that they exist in a world between their two ears. Could you tell me a little bit about the characters that are Leonard and Hungry Paul, to those who haven't actually read the book yet, and maybe talk to us a little bit about their outlook on life and the world outside themselves?
Yeah, so Leonard, I suppose the book began with Leonard. Leonard sort of had started to emerge from my imagination and sort of prompted me to sort of think about quiet people and the overlooked people. Leonard is a guy in his early 30s. He lives, as you could hear from the extract that my ghost just read, he lives quite happily and contentedly at home with his mother. He is a ghostwriter of children's encyclopedias. And he's a man, I think, who has a sort of gentle side to him, a reflective side for him, but also someone who's a little bit unsure about how to engage with the outside world without being swallowed up by it. And his friend Hungry Paul is a very, as you say, self-contained character. He's somebody who tries to live really in harmony with the world around him. And for him, that harmony is not a question of understanding the world or not understanding the world. So the answer to the world is not some puzzle that he has solved or that he has some great insight to. He just doesn't impose himself on the world. He just tries to, he said he tries to live according to the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm. And of course, his other main guideline is the Green Cross Code, which is to stop and look and listen before diving into anything. So his way of living is a peaceful way of living, but it's not a passive way of living. He's still very much on his own terms, trying to engage with the world, live with his life, much to the puzzlement of those around him.
That's beautifully put. Thank you. It's and then I kind of, obviously one of the key characters, or indeed our kind of protagonist at the heart of your novel is Joe. And so throughout the course of the book, you know, one of the themes that you are looking at is the complexity of drug culture and kind of that which is hidden in plain sight within society. And you know, when we meet Joe, he's a scholarship kid. He's very good at music, or sorry, good at art, I should say. But yet, when he moves to the school, his colleagues are suddenly trying to get him to source drugs for them, and so it's kind of through Joe we kind of get a sense of some of the class structures and kind of divisions within society. Could you tell us a little bit about Joe and kind of the building of him as a character?
Yeah, so Joe actually was really hard to write. Finn sort of just wrote himself, and I suppose it's because the inevitability of what was going to happen to Finn, he just sort of wrote himself. Whereas Joe is a really, really guarded sort of character. He has his armor up all the time. So even when I was writing, I found that I was explaining a lot of the stuff that Joe was doing, but it was me talking for him instead of him just being who he was. So I was really, really conscious. I didn't want any sort of stereotypical character from a stereotypical class or a stereotypical background. And I think with Joe, the complexity with Joe as well is that he's from a sort of notorious gang family, really. His father is known in and out of prison. When we meet Joe, his father is back in prison again. He's a scholarship kid in a local school, but a lot of the conflict he finds there with his peers is his own armor up there as well. Like he has his own views or perceptions about what children from that area, a more affluent area than he's from, should be, whereas it's the same as working for him then as well. So I wanted to look a lot at perceptions that people have based on particularly where you're from. So like I'm from Dublin 15 myself, and it's just a whole mix of lots of, like you have Castleknock, you have like, I was from Mulhuddard, and you have like a whole mix of different, you know, people there, I suppose. And it's that, I think in particular around Dublin, you get that sort of postcode discrimination. You know, it's like, oh, well, you don't sound like you're from Mulhuddard, you don't sound like you're from Hartstown. I say, what's somebody from Mulhuddard supposed to sound like? You know, it's my mother as well, she's from Ballymun, but she's a classical pianist, you know, so it's this whole thing that people will hear something and then just have a preconceived conception of what it is you should be or where it is you should fit into. And I remember there was a poet, Martin Dyer, he's a fabulous poet, and I heard him speak before, and he was talking about one of his poems is on the ordinary level syllabus for Leaving Cert English, and he was coming in to speak to a school. And when he got to the school, the teacher said, oh, well, you're going to be speaking with the higher level students because the ordinary level students won't appreciate you. And you're sort of there going, that teacher had made this decision that a whole group of students didn't deserve to hear a poet who had written a poem that was on their syllabus for Leaving Cert. So it's not even saying that you don't deserve to listen to this poet. It's like saying, well, you're not going to be a writer, you're not going to be a poet, you're not going to be any of these things because of a preconception about what these children would or would not like. So I really wanted to sort of just have that in there about playing with preconceptions that people might have on both sides, you know, so I hope that came true.
No, very definitely. It was such a beautifully written world that we kind of did get a sense of the kind of the complexities of, I guess, what's going on. And, you know, you do see it as the story goes on, that we're seeing the world through the boy's eyes, and we're really getting a sense of, you know, the complexity of the world and seeing a young brain trying to process that. Like I wrote down a quote that I think it was Finn said early enough into the narrative, which kind of talks to the idea of kind of the complexity of family, which is, I think, an interesting theme that kind of runs through the novel. And he says, his foot stood on her foot, and all I could think of was how Grandad used to get me and Joe to stand on his feet while we were dancing around the kitchen. I don't think Dad wanted to dance. Could you talk to us a little bit about the experience of forming the family and kind of the journey that you wanted to take them on?
Yeah, so again, I didn't want to be stereotypical. So especially with Dad, like I didn't want him to be the stereotypical violent male. And I wanted it subtle, especially with the domestic violence element of it. I wanted it to be very subtle. So a lot of the domestic violence is through Finn's eyes, actually. You see it more through his eyes than anybody else. And just he mentions about the tattoo, and her dad says that's because he wants Ma to remember that she belongs to him. And he doesn't realise this as anything really sinister, or about the cigarette burn that she's trying to hide, little things like that. So I was very conscious that I wanted it quite subtle. I didn't want anything that was going to be sort of hitting you over the head. And I also wanted to be very conscious of not patronizing anybody in that situation themselves. You know, I suppose trying to look at it through an empathetic lens, I suppose, and try and create complexities in Da in particular, and try and just seed in little things about his background and other things which might inform who he is today. And then also Joe's absolute utter fear that he's going to end up like his dad. That's just his one thing. He wants to keep his head down. He wants to get out of school, get away from the flats, get away from absolutely everything. But then he realizes that you can't, like, that's part of him and who he is. So yeah.
No, thank you. It's and then kind of just Rónán, looking at the family, like kind of one of the most enjoyable family, well, obviously the kind of one of the two key family dynamics that we talk about in Leonard and Hungry Paul is Hungry Paul's family. And, you know, one of the plot points that's key to the narrative is this idea that his sister is preparing to get married. And so we've got Grace's kind of imminent wedding as something that really does drive the narrative. And then when we're talking about the family, you describe them as the three of them, which would be mum, dad, and his sister, had always seen themselves as bumpers along the bowling lane for him to bounce between, saving him from the mundane dangers and guiding him towards his achievements, modest though they were. Could you talk to us a little bit about how you approached family dynamics?
Yeah, I think I sort of felt that more generally in the book to understand the characters. And bear in mind, I'd never written a book before, so you don't really know how to write a book. But I thought a good way of trying to see different sides to characters would be to put them in different combinations with other characters who would bring out different aspects to them. And also, particularly in Hungry Paul's case, he's largely discussed in his absence. You know, he's not really, until quite late on in the book, sort of given a direct opportunity to sort of explain how he sees himself. And I think to a large extent, my writing of the family, one thing that I think people have picked up on is that they're by and large a happy family. They're not a dysfunctional family, they have their normal family tensions. But I think that probably to some extent comes from emerging from 10 years of reading children's books with my kids, you know. And I suppose once you have children yourself, you're sort of slightly invested in the idea that happy families are possible because you're trying to make one. So I wanted to try and think about the way in which family roles are set quite early on in life. And there isn't really a mechanism for them to be revisited. So there's a bit in an early chapter where Grace comes in, and I'm actually, the more I talk about the book, I'm slightly regretting I didn't call it Leonard Hungry Paul and Grace, but because she kind of gets forgotten about a bit. But early on in the book, there's a scene where she's a few years older than Hungry Paul, and Hungry Paul tears a fiver as he takes it out of his pocket, and she immediately swaps the torn fiver for a clean one. He just goes back to whatever he was doing, and it's sort of an example of she was sort of given responsibility for him quite early in life, and nobody ever turned it off. And that can quite happen, you know, where if your older brother is 2 years older than you, then on your 50th birthday, he's still 2 years older than you. And the family dynamic doesn't get kind of reset, and there isn't really an obvious mechanism from that. So it's interesting. It was interesting to me anyway, to try and show a family in a sort of steady state, to show them going through a change, and then to show a new steady state, and then sort of leave the book at that, to try and observe how that can happen, a sort of successful transplant from a sort of a lifetime of having certain coordinates between them that get tweaked and changed in light of experience. And I think that there's something I believe in that. I didn't believe it when I wrote it, or I didn't know I believed it when I wrote it. but it helped me kind of understand that that's how people often change. You know, it doesn't, there's only so much you can do from within yourself. You do rely on what other people can bring out of you. And that sort of, I started to see that a bit more when I was working on the book.
I think that sort of sentiment, I think all of us have probably been exploring within ourselves in some way in response to the kind of the particularly unusual moment that the pandemic is putting us in this past year. But actually, I kind of want to touch on something that you said there, and this is a question to both of you, but Rónán, we might just come to you first. You mentioned that this was the first book that you had written, and I think to everyone who's just joining us, you might just kind of fill in the wider backstory to your own kind of narrative and what's kind of led you to the point of writing this book.
Yeah, I suppose I've always sort of had a creative side. I've been involved in the music scene for a long time, from the early 90s up until about 10 years ago. I'm involved in the independent music scene, music collectives, running small label, putting out music at 3 albums. The third one, Dictionary Crimes, was nominated for the Choice Music Prize. And really, my songs were very storytelling type songs. So I think a lot of people who know me from that period, you know, were not that surprised. I went on to try my hand at writing, but I was surprised because I thought it was completely different. You know, because songs are so much about condensing things down, whereas a novel is so much more expansive. But I more or less decided back in sort of 2012, you know, my day job was busy, my kids were young, I was a little bit burnt out, and I sort of thought, okay, I'm done with this now. Not in a sort of stroppy way, but just I felt I'd satisfied, and I felt you know, I always, one thing I've learned from, and 30 years, I feel like being creative, I feel like on a continuous basis, I really learned to listen to that creativity. You know, it's not something that I project into the world. It's something I listen to and try and channel. So I never try and steer it or direct it or anything like that, or own it. But I'm listening to it, it felt like it was becoming more faint. But then 5 years went by, and each of my albums were 5 years apart. So my sort of biological creative clock had come around and chimed. And I felt that there were these characters there with me. So I really just started writing without thinking I was going to write a novel. It was really just to get to know Leonard. But once I got into it, I decided, well, a great thing about writing prose is that it's kind of hard to stop somebody writing prose, you know, and there aren't many things you need to get going. You don't need a drummer, which is a huge help. So I just really kept going, and quite a, you know, 3 months I had the first draft done, working on it every day. And that was just a build-up of creative energy over those 5 years, I think.
Wow. That's an intense 3 months. It's and Fíona, your own personal experience.
Yeah, so I'm the same. I'm not somebody who always had a dream of being a writer or anything at all like that. Writing wasn't something that I ever thought that I was going to do. I always loved reading, like always loved reading. Lived in the library, and I loved English in school. But funny enough, I cannot remember any part of the writing element of the Leaving Cert. Like I loved the plays in particular. So I thought that if I ever was going to write anything, that it would be a play, actually. So it was only really maybe, I suppose about 5 years ago that I started saying, you know, this is something that I really want to do. And I started off writing children's middle grade. So a bit like you, Rónán, is that I had 2 young kids at home at the time, and plus I'm a primary school teacher. Like I started off with music actually as well. My primary degree is in music. And then I went on to do primary school teaching. But so I was sort of in that world of children's literature all the time. And so it's just started writing little bits and pieces. I never finished on it. And so I've got like this ghost town of middle grade humorous novels all over the desktop of the laptop. And then I decided then about 3 years ago, I said, okay, I just want to see if this is something that I can do. So I started looking into doing an MLit in creative writing. Now it is 100% not something that you need to do if you want to write a book. And as Rónán said, you can just sit down and write. You don't need anything else there. You can have your fool's cap or you can have your laptop or whatever. But for me, because I hadn't done English, because writing was never on my radar really, I just wanted to do it for myself. And it was 2 things: to give me a bit more confidence, but also to test my mettle, I suppose, and said, listen, I'm just going to give this a year, see, you know, if I can make it or not. If I can't, that's grand. I can just still faff about myself, but just want to really give this a go. and see what comes of it. So it was only really, now when I was looking around here, I needed something part-time because I wasn't in a position where I could give up my job either. And all the part-time masters here in creative writing are during the morning. Like, so there's none that you can do work and then do your lectures in the evening time. Now, maybe there is now, but at the time there wasn't. So my sister, she's living in Glasgow, and she said, listen, I think the University of Glasgow has a distance learning option in creative writing. Why don't you look it up? So I did. And I did it within a year and did a part-time like that. The lectures were in the evenings, which suited me great. And it was in the February then of doing that MLit, where there was a tweet on Twitter, and it was a palliative care pediatric doctor. And he had been talking to children in his care what they'd missed the most when they died. And when I read that tweet, I wrote the first chapter of the book, and it's more or less exactly the same. It hasn't really changed at all, but it was very, very different to what I'd written before. Like, the style was quite similar to the kids stuff that I was writing, as in it was quite colloquial and sort of, that style, but it was very, very different. And I had an amazing tutor at the time, and she just goes, this is what you should be writing. You're treating it as a hobby. You have to, if you really want this, just go for it. Trust your gut, trust your instinct, and just go for it. So for me, it really gave me a boost to my confidence doing that. And again, you really don't have to, but for me, it was something that was really valuable to me at the time.
It sounded like there was certain elements of kind of chance and kind of timing of certain kind of opportunities presenting themselves in terms of seeing that tweet, it sparking the idea. And I guess I'd love to talk a little bit more about the books. And so kind of that leads me quite appropriately to ask you a bit about Finn. So kind of coming back to the name of the book, Boys Don't Cry, there's the quote where he says, I've never seen Dad cry. He tells us the crying is a sign of weakness, that boys don't cry. So obviously Finn falls ill, and then we see a lot happen in his relationship with Joe, and then a longer story about strength, brotherly love, and kind of a family dynamic. I'm sure you don't want to give too much away, but tell us a little bit about how you approached such a emotive, sensitive subject.
Yeah, I know, it's funny because like that, it just sort of came out of nowhere, and the story was just there. Like, originally I was going to write it. It was the story came as Finn and his ma Annie, but as soon as I went down to write it, it was Joe that was there the whole time, and I knew the story before I began. It just sort of came. It was strange, and like, as I said, Finn just was quite easy to, he just wrote. I don't even really remember writing much of him. It was just sort of came out. But yeah, that was one thing that I really, really, really wanted there, was that sibling bond. And I wanted to show, like, I wanted this to be a book about love as well, and about hope, and about all of those type of things. And I think for young males in particular living in more disadvantaged areas, that like educational disadvantage is just so commonplace. And there's studies done that even within male cohorts and female cohorts from exactly the same type of family backgrounds and supports, it's far more likely for a young male to fall into educational disadvantage than female. And also that if in your area you have the likes of, you have a local drug gang running in that area, it can be seen as an alternative to something else. It's fallen into that sort of world. And Joe's just hyper aware of that world, and that he just didn't want anything to do with it. But it's also sort of exploring the fact that people think that to be young and male, that you have agency, whereas, especially with this situation, I wanted to explore as well the whole element of choice. And do you have free will in the choices that you make, or do circumstances such as where you're from or your family supports impact on those choices made available to you? So, and of course, Desi Murphy, which is named after my dad's best friend, because I couldn't think of any other name. And then once it was done, I couldn't think of any other name. So he's the complete opposite to him, just to put that out there. But Desi Murphy, like, he's there and he's waiting for that vulnerability. That's what he's there for, and you see it happening all the time. It's sort of waiting and picking on somebody who's in a vulnerable situation and offering them an alternative, of course, with their own ulterior motive behind it.
You do kind of get the impression that, in some circumstances, choice really is a privilege to have. It's not
Yeah, and I remember my dad telling me a story before about the school that he was in, and there was a Leaving Cert music practical was going on, and one of the students didn't turn up, and he, of course, he drove out to the house and he said, listen, what's going on? And the mother had overdosed and was in hospital. There was no dad on the scene, and there was young children in the family. So his choice was, do my Leaving Cert practical, or there's nobody to mind the rest of the family here, like, you know, and even worries in the back of his head the whole time. If I let anybody know that my ma isn't here, like, is our social services going to be called? So like, that's the choice that he had in front of him. So it's just, you do take choice for granted, and you do take, you know, the privilege of being able to make choices for granted a lot of the time as well, I think.
And you hear, and especially what you're talking about there, you're hearing stories of children having to make very adult decisions. Okay, yeah, it's an interesting, it's a very complex subject that you're taking on, and you've done it so beautifully. You really, really have. It's but kind of, I think one thing that shines through both stories is this overriding theme of friendship and the value and, I guess, richness that true friendship can bring into the world and into someone's life. And there's a sentence in the book where there's no better cure for one's own worries than to help someone else with theirs. And I think for Leonard and Hungry Paul, they're two beautifully constructed characters. And you talk of their ability to sit comfortably in silence. And I think that in itself is such a strong marker of a genuine, true friendship. And I guess I'd love to see them a little bit more through your eyes. Like, what has cemented their bond? How did their relationship form and evolve? And
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's not in the book. That's one thing. When I was writing it, I was thinking, how do you distinguish the characters? Like if I was writing a play, right, I could give one character a yellow hat and another one a beard, and then every time the bearded guy came on, you go, oh, that's Leonard. There's the yellow hat, that's Hungry Paul. But you don't have that in the novel. So how do you signify? So the way I did it was, characters have different combinations of either backstory and interiority. So a lot of backstory for Grace, only a limited amount. You get Leonard's beginning, and then fast forward adulthood. Hungry Paul, you only get secondhand his past and his background. He doesn't give you any of himself. So when it came to sort of make them sort of work as sort of friends, I think what I found really was that dialogue and relationships in novels, you sort of have to, they're in a frequency range, and you just have to try and find that and keep them there. And initially, when I was working on the book, they kept turning into each other. So they were like two sock puppets that were just sort of making the same sort of observations. So over time, just to try and distinguish them, the kind of things they might say. And I think I think what's core to their friendship, and probably core to all the relationships in the book, is acceptance. They accept each other, and I think that's probably a sort of brotherly love, or any form of love at its core, is to accept the person. And once they have that, they don't need a huge amount else. And of course, they're thinking about the same puzzles, and they allow each other space. And because they enjoy those silences, they're not competitive. They're not trying to. There's probably about 5 or 6 board games, played in the book. None of the games are finished. They're all unfinished. It's purely a prop to sort of get somebody going. So I suppose it's probably a shyness thing. Eye contact is difficult for some people. So they often say that with teenagers, if you have a problem, go driving, and if you're looking at the road and they're beside you, you'll have a more open conversation. So it's a bit like that. So it's a prop for them. They accept each other. They're not trying to win the conversation. I often think that actually, after you die, who gets all the arguments you won? Nobody. They're useless. Why work so hard winning them? They don't go anywhere. So they live by that. They're non-competitive. They accept each other, and actually, if you've those two qualities, you can probably get along with most people, I would have thought.
You would think that. It's I hadn't picked up on the piece about the board games, but there's a lovely kind of pureness and niceness to that. And for Leonard, one thing that I thought was interesting, if we kind of look at the idea of kind of role models, I guess. Leonard, through his writing, he was kind of mindful of the fact that he had the ability to potentially influence people and to be a role model in the kind of the narratives that he's put forward and the kind of the way that his writing and therefore his subjects are perceived. And I found myself reading these sorts of thoughts, wondering if you in turn had the same consideration. And I guess I'm kind of curious, when you were writing the book, were you thinking about the reader, or did the reader play into, is that a slightly convoluted question, do you know?
No, I know what you're asking me. You're asking me, is it a sneaky book? The answer is yes. What I mean by that is that I think in the book, I'm you know, quite well, semi-transparently, translucently, trying to propose a way of being in the world. You know, not to just sit back and say the world is a bad place and bad things happen, because that's true. And I don't think there's anything in the book that suggests that's not the case. You know, if that weren't the case, they would have no problem engaging with the world. You know, as Leonard says, the true tale of history is worryingly short of comeuppance. So there's the world is often a bad place. At the same time, accepting that as it is, how do you live in it? And the book tries to project, well, who would find it most difficult to live in a bad world? Maybe quiet people, maybe gentle people, maybe people who are very easily brushed aside. So if I can figure out a way of them being in the world, then I've got some sort of chink in terms of the darkness that's out there for myself, as much as for a novel, to prove it to myself that there is a path through the forest. And if that's the case, you can walk that path and then come back and bring other people through the path. But you have to walk it first. You have to get to the other side. There's no point going halfway and saying, I think it's safe. So the book, and to be honest with you, I think I'm probably, having just finished the second book, I think I'm probably still in that place. You know, I'm still trying to figure out how you get all the way through to the other end. And I'll probably keep writing until I've answered that, I think.
Oh, what a gorgeous mission as far as it goes. It's well, on behalf of all of us, I hope you get to the end of the story. And then, you know, obviously role models again is something that's really quite prevalent throughout the course of your own book, talking about the impact of positive role models, but also detrimentally negative. And I kind of wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how you kind of assigned those responsibilities to the characters.
Yeah, I genuinely believe that one person can make a difference. Like, I really, really do genuinely believe that. And I think that's something that I really wanted throughout the book. And you can see it with the teachers in particular. You know, there's Mr. Broderick, the principal in Joe's school, who genuinely cares and wants to help Joe, even when Joe's on this self-destruct mission. You can also see it with Mrs. O'Sullivan, the teacher in Finn's situation, you know, giving books and never asking for them back, checking in to see how he is, you know. And it's these, again, that positive role model, the friendships as well that Joe has, Sabine in particular, who's just not going to give up on Joe no matter what. And I wanted it to be that, like what you were saying, Rónán, as well, it's like looking at that, making your way through this, but in a positive way. I didn't want, you know, this, like, it is a gritty sort of world that's in Boys Don't Cry, but I wanted it to focus on that love and that hope and that kindness, and that no matter what, if there is that one person in your life who gives a shit, basically, who will just stick by you no matter what. And I think as well, as a teacher, like, you have to be so conscious of what you say to young people and young adults. And like, you talk to anybody and they will hold with them, you know, the negatives of what teachers say, like, you can't sing or you can't write or you're useless or whatever these type of things are. Like, you talk to anybody and at any age, and they will have something that was said to them by somebody that you'll hold on to. But likewise, the opposite is true as well. You know, if you have a teacher who's encouraging, inspiring, believes in you, that's going to stick with you for your life as well, you know. So it's I wanted to focus more on that, the positive influences that other people can have in your life. And Rónán, a bit like what you were saying in your interview with Ryan Tubridy the other day, like to a person, doing a kind act might be nothing, but it's not nothing to the person who's receiving it. So that's something that I wanted to bring out in the book as well. You know, even a small little thing is something absolutely massive to the person receiving it. So
no, it's a beautiful sentiment, and I think the fact that, you know, you are dealing with an inherently sad and tragic kind of circumstance. It is one of the kind of the key experiences in the book, but there is this overriding sense of hope, and you kind of, even as the reader, you do get that kind of glance into it. And I can't imagine that it's an easy challenge to try and address such a big theme such as trauma without kind of losing the light in it.
Yeah, one of the things that I did do in research for this was I read a lot of blogs from parents and from siblings who had lost somebody the same way as the characters have in the book. And what came across through all of that was that holding on to the positives, holding on to the memories. And of course, like when something like that happens, a child, it's particularly tragic. And you know, that's universal no matter where you're from or what your situation is. But that was the one thing that came out again and again. One thing that helped people cope, I suppose, in those situations was learning how to live on without the person, but seeing them as with you rather than looking down at you. I know that was mentioned when my own father died. The priest at the funeral, he was a really, really good friend of my father's. And he mentioned that rather than thinking of them looking down at you, think of them as you're carrying them with you, and then you become the eyes and you become the ears for the things that you know that they'd love. And that actually brought me huge comfort. And it's funny because before this book, the only grief that I'd experienced was my grandparents. So this is a completely different type of grief, but I really understand that now. Whereas I think that treads through the book a bit as well, especially with the bucket list and stuff like that that's being created. But that came from reading real blogs, so you could feel that sentiment coming through, you know, that wanting to carry them still in the world, even though they were gone.
It's such a powerful idea, and it's such a I'd never heard that kind of carrying them with you idea before. And yeah, sorry, I'm not going to eloquently respond to that, but I think it's a powerfully nice sentiment. And I'm just mindful. I think we should take a moment just to have a look at some of the questions that have come through. So Norma was wondering, would either of you have any writing rituals? And indeed, how would you feel if your work was to be adapted into a film? I'll open that to the floor if either of you have any strong opinions.
I don't have particular rituals other than, I try to squeeze. I think probably with all debut novels, they are written in the sort of cracks in the day. You know, those little bits of time that you, in a guilty way, steal for yourself when you're not needed for other things. So I deliberately didn't actually try to get precious, you know, that I had to have my lucky rabbit's foot beside me, or I had to be facing the sun, or that I had to have my favorite socks on, because you know, a lot of it was written at dark stations or on Ryanair flights or in hotels in Brussels or up in my box room. So personally, no, I don't have any rituals, and I try to keep as, you know, spontaneous as I can be.
Yeah, I'm the same. I don't have any at all. I think because I'm working full time and I have the kids, you literally just have to take the time when you can find it. The same, just when they're in sleep, whether it's get up an hour earlier, you know, in the mornings now, not on a work day, but maybe at the weekends, and the same in hotel bathrooms, also all sorts. It was wherever you get the time to fit it in, and exactly the same. Yeah.
Fiona, Eleanor is wondering, would Boys Don't Cry be suitable for a 15-year-old?
Um, yeah, I'd say so. Like, it's dealing with adult themes, but I know myself when I was a teenager, like 11, 12, I was reading everything under the sun, Jilly Cooper, Stephen King, everything. So if you think, yeah, it is dealing with very dark themes. So if they're particularly sensitive, it might be just very upsetting for them. But definitely, if you think they could handle that, then yeah.
Okay, and then one idea that both of your books that we've kind of spoken about a little bit, both of your stories touch on the theme of the outsider, and I know from conversations and from kind of other interviews that I've seen online, both of you have had moments where you've questioned where exactly your own book sits on a shelf within a bookstore. And I wonder, is that kind of an observation on a wider conversation that we need to have more conversation about outsiders because we are so obsessed with putting everything very neatly into a box?
Yeah, I think you undo that good work if you have an outsider section in your bookshop. So it's one of those things that you see conversations in the publishing world. We have to have more difference, and here's a list of the differences we'd like to see, please. So I think, this is just a very personal view. When I read books from non-Anglophone cultures, I think that's less of an issue, in my opinion. I think there are certain preoccupations in the publishing world in the US, UK, that set a particular standard in terms of how you write about different people in society, that I think is less prevalent in other types of literature. I don't know, Fiona, what do you think?
Yeah, I just find the whole thing very strange, actually, because that was my biggest what would you say, piece of feedback that I got, rejection that I got, was, we don't know where this fits on the shelf. It was just constant, even with publishers as well. So I went through the whole slush pile process and everything, and even with publishers, like, I didn't end up with a big mama auction or preempts or any of that thing. I had one publisher who offered, and luckily, like, she's phenomenal, like, in this dream publisher, but they could have just as easily not. It would just happened to land on her desk. If it had landed at somebody else in that company's desk, it mightn't have been the same thing. So I agree, Rónán. I think there's this obsession with boxing and placing and where you fit into it, and it's a very strange, because I feel both with the two books here, Leonard and Hungry Paul and Boys Don't Cry, I don't see it as being anything radical that doesn't fit in a do you know what I mean? It's like, it's not some bizarre concept or story, so it's strange when you get that type of feedback.
Yeah, it's a funny one because it's not something that I would have thought of from reading either piece. It was only because I saw it, and indeed you had mentioned it to me, that it crossed my mind that it was kind of a circumstance. But then to make an assumption, I would assume you both grew up loving reading. The love of words and stories is something that I'm really quite strongly getting from, I guess, how you both talk about the world of storytelling and writing. And I think, going back to being earlier in the conversation, when you're talking about the fact that, there are children that are not necessarily going to get the same opportunities as other children. And so I think it's an interesting moment to kind of step back, especially in the context of this being One Dublin One Book, which is encouraging us all to come together and to collectively be reading. Perhaps a very big and lofty question, but I kind of wonder, to both of you, perhaps whoever wants to kind of come in on this first, but if we're trying to instill a love of reading in the younger generations, what can we be doing?
I think one thing that we're really lucky with here in Ireland, and I know, Rónán, you've spoken about this before, is just our library culture and the accessibility of it. And also we've a really strong state education system here as well. It's sort of, particularly in primary school, we don't really have private primary schools. I know we do have a few, but And there's fabulous work going on in our education system, particularly with libraries, and every school is linked with their local library. The local librarian will come in and speak with the children. And I know most primary school teachers will have a huge graph for reading and inspiring their children to read as much as possible, you know. So I think we're lucky in that regard. I don't know, Rónán, how you feel about that.
Yeah, I do. Although I'm conscious that I have two sons aged 10 and 12, and they can smell a mile off when an adult thinks something's good for them. So they've read enough books about bullying. They've read enough books about, you know, people coming against the odds, and they've actually, unfortunately, they've kind of turned away from fiction the last year or two and gone back to sort of factual books, because there's a massive gap for realistic fiction for their age, largely because realistic fiction would have bad language in it, and sort of references that you would be considered non-PG, but they enjoy internet humor, which isn't really as prevalent in fiction for children that age. They're not interested in wizards. They're not interested with Timmy who has a magic doodad that turns him into something else. They're not interested in that, dragons, none of that stuff. So what their favorite stuff when they're younger, I think, were the Shirley Hughes books, you know, kind of realism that they could relate to. And I remember they used to love that program Little Lunch. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's an Australian show, but kids in the yard, and it was brilliant kids dialogue. And actually the dialogue in Fiona's book is amazing. But they can tell a mile off when it's been written for children by adults, and they're not into that. So I think if you want to encourage children to read, I think just have books in the house, and also read yourself. Like, I think it would be good if, you know, if you want your children to read, they have to see you reading. You know, if you're not sitting there reading, talk earlier about role models. How do they get a sense of that's a thing, that's an option? So, you know, if people are not reading themselves and not reading when their family is there, they can't really, you know, expect their children to sort of cop that's an option. So I think that's another thing people can do.
That's very sound. Then I see Shane here has written in to ask, and he's curious how the process of writing these books has influenced, or indeed will influence, any. And Rónán, you mentioned that you're currently working on the what happens next. So we might come to you first. That, you know, how has Leonard Hungry Paul actually influenced your future writing?
Oh, you mean Panenka that's out in May?
Exactly the one I mean. Tell me more.
The reasonably priced novel that's out next month. Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I think second books are difficult is because you don't know what you need to learn from the first one, and you don't know what you need to unlearn. So there's a process of figuring that out. That's what I found. And I remember I was working on Panenka at a time when Leonard Hungry Paul was out, and the dialogue kept slipping back into Leonard and Shelley territory, and I had to actually put it aside. There's also just technical differences in the book. There's a lot of hellos and goodbyes in Leonard Hungry Paul. You know, they arrive, scenes start at the beginning and finish at the end. Panenka is very different. The scenes are all clipped. You just get straight out. I describe it as like a burger, no bun, no sauce, no lettuce. It's just a burger. So I think there's a huge psychological element to a second book, where you're aware of that it's going to be read. You're aware of the reaction. You're aware that people would have liked certain things in your first book that aren't in your second book. So that's all there. You have to power through that. My approach was what I call the Lego approach, which is that in order to build something new, you have to take apart what you've just built. So not to try and just add on to your first book, deconstruct it and start, clear a space in your brain, in your life, in your ego. Be prepared to let certain readers go if they don't come with you. That's an okay thing to do. That's why I approached it anyway.
Okay, and that's out in May, you're saying?
Yeah, the 20th of May.
Okay, well then in the weeks coming up, Fiona, Boys Don't Cry. So this is coming out in less than 3 weeks to go, is it?
Yeah, the 22nd of April, it's out, so very surreal altogether. It's mad.
What is a launch during a pandemic going to look like?
Zoom. Hello. Yeah, so I bought a dress and I'll be getting the wine in, but I've work as well, so I'll be in work the next day. So it won't be mad hooly, but sure, look, it's it is what it is, you know, that's the way. I've nothing to compare it to anyway. Like I know, like Rónán, you'll notice a huge difference between your next one and the last one, whereas I've actually have nothing to compare it to at all, so I actually don't know.
But it's that'll be an important milestone and quite an amazing accomplishment to celebrate. Nonetheless, it's even if it is in Zoom, but as you said, a nice dress and a glass of wine to toast the occasion.
Yeah.
And I guess just kind of that was an amazingly quick hour, but we're kind of coming up to the hour. And I guess, you know, for the reader, you know, in going through both of these books, you know, for Leonard and Hungry Paul, it was a story about finding content. And then Boys Don't Cry, it was building resilience. That's what it meant to me. That's what I took from the stories. And I kind of wonder, you know, looking at your own work and kind of being kind of looking at what you kind of ultimately create and put out into the world, you know, I wonder if you could just kind of tell everyone who's with us this evening, you know, what are the kind of the most important, what's the message that you think comes out of your work? And we've kind of roughly touched around this subject over the course of the evening. So I don't know, maybe Rónán, I might come to you first.
You have a bit of thinking time there, Fiona. That was finishing on a tough one. I think with Leonard and Hungry Paul specifically, I think the sort of message of the book, or what the book has ended up meaning, and I've been talking about this book for 2 years, and particularly so lately because of One Dublin One Book, and I'm still getting to understand it. You know, it's only when you see it, I feel a bit like, you know, an artist's model, you know, they sort of stand nude and then everyone shows their picture back at you, what they think you look like. And you go, oh, okay, that's what I look like. But that's what my book looks like to you. So you're kind of seeing it back through that lens of how other people receive it. For me, well, the way I write, honestly, is I say I'm listening to an intuition. I just channel it. I don't actually take the book personally, you know, even doing well or badly or anything. And I just sort of see it as a sort of a little capsule of my preoccupations at that time, that I otherwise would have been boring people with and trying to squeeze and shoehorn into conversation. That there's sort of, it was a safe place for me to put all that stuff that was rattling around in my head, and I'm in there all over the place. You know, I don't know whether I'm none of the characters or I'm all of the characters or I'm sometimes whatever. So I don't know. Books have, what amazes me is just how much can be in a sentence, in a paragraph in a book. And I like the lack of urgency about nailing all that down. So I can just sort of think about it for a while. And maybe I have to just, you know, not talk about Leonard Hungry Paul for like 10 years, and then eventually it'll all become clear to me. So I'm kind of proud of the fact that I have a book I can do that with, you know, that it isn't just, I really just had a PowerPoint, 80,000 word PowerPoint that I managed to capture my key points. I only try to learn about the book by writing it, and I'm still learning about it, and I'm kind of happy that's, I'm like, okay, that's what writing a novel involves, and I like that, so I'll keep doing it because I think it's a nice way to live your life.
That's beautiful. It's a lovely output for us readers to enjoy. So please continue living your life that way. It's then Fíona, yourself, in terms of kind of, you know, the kind of message that you take away from the book and put out into the world.
Yeah, I suppose like very similar to what you were saying, Rónán, like when you go down to write, you're not really thinking of any central messages or themes or anything. You're just sort of writing it and just writing this snapshot about this family in this particular moment in time. Like I was sort of conscious that I didn't want to be preachy or come out with any sort of, I don't know, theme or message or whatever it is. But I do approach it with empathy. And I think when you're writing, that you have empathy for your characters, if that makes sense. And And then as well, like sure, once it's written and once it's published, like it's not yours anymore, it belongs to readers. And like what you were saying as well, Rónán, like readers will take all sorts of themes and messages and everything from this book, which I think is pretty incredible that you never even thought of yourself, you know. So I'd be like, oh yeah, I definitely thought of that while I was writing it. No, I genuinely didn't, but it's really special to hear feedback from readers, you know, that it moved or touched them in a certain way, or, you know, that took a message from it, whether it was in there subconsciously or not. But it's a pretty special thing.
It's wonderful. It really, I think sincerely, can only wish you absolutely the best for the launch later this month. It is such a beautiful piece of writing. I think it was at Marion Keyes, I saw online recently gushing about how beautiful it was, and I just remember reading it and kind of going, yes, that it is just a truly wonderful piece. And I googled it earlier, and it is available for pre-order on the couple of bookshops that I had a look at. So that's Boys Don't Cry by Fíona Scarlett, which will be coming out this April. And then obviously this evening, this event has come as part of the One Dublin One Book Festival, of which Leonard and Hungry Paul is this year's novel. And Rónán, my understanding is that there is a number of other events are going to happen now throughout April, and that all the information about the festival is on One Dublin One Book.ie. But that it's a beautiful book, and I think I wrote down, as Ricochet described it, it's a word of mouth phenomenon I've pressed into the hands of so many people, which is I have already promised this copy to one of my closest friends, so I can already live by his words. So unless either of you have any final thoughts, I want to sincerely thank you both so much for being so honest and being so generous with sharing your process of writing these books, of your experiences and of the stories that you're telling. So sincerely, unless either of you have anything to say.
No, just thanks very much, and thanks Fiona, and thanks to you, Sarah. It was really enjoyable. Thanks to everyone for coming and for all your questions. I know there were lots of questions we didn't get to, so you can probably find, if there's anything burning you need to know, you can find us on Twitter and just ask it there if you want. I'd be happy to help.
Yeah, exactly the same. Second that.
Great. Well, then the after party continues on Twitter. Well, on that note, that brings us to the end of this week's 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. This evening was obviously brought to you in association with One Dublin One Book. So Fiona, Rónán, sincerely, thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for being here, and good evening.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.